This week, Coral had two appointments. One was at the hairdresser's and one was at the dentist. I think I know which one she preferred. But the thing about these appointments you make, some of those places where you make an appointment, they'll actually ring you up or text you for you to confirm that you've got an appointment with them. And I've even confirmed and then still forgotten. But there is actually two appointments every one of us will have in life that we don't actually set the date or the time, and yet they're going to happen whether we remember them or not. And one of them is very personal. It's private. It's the day you die. I remember sitting with my dad the night before he died, and I was just sitting on his bed, and he said, "You know, son," he said, "this is my last night on earth." Now, I don't know how he knew that, but somehow God's Spirit had whispered to him that he had appointment the next day. And there's another appointment that it's public. It's still very personal, and Jesus describes it as the day of judgment. And we're going to all be there together. It's going to happen publicly, but it's going to be very personal for us. There's a trend in our culture where people have lost the fear of death. Like once upon a time, people were very fearful of death, but that's sort of dropped away. It's changed over time. But the fear of the process of dying, the fear of pain, the fear of suffering, that's still there. There's words that have crept into our language like quality of life. I didn't hear that when I was growing up as a kid. The thought of the phrase assisted dying. When I was a kid growing up, I could never have imagined that last year the Victorian government would legalise killing people that were going to die soon anyway. Terminally ill people. I know there's conditions like a doctor has to consider that you would die within the next 6 months. Or for people with MS or motor neurone disease, there's a 12-month. And it's called voluntary euthanasia. I never can get that word right. But I actually understand why our community think that that's a good idea. Because in our community, there is a general sort of a thought that if you die, you go to a better place. In fact, people put the word RIP, rest in peace. And someone that's dying of cancer, people think, well, it's better because if they're dead, they're in a better place. They're in heaven. Some people don't believe that. In fact, they actually believe that it's better for you to be dead because once you're dead, you cease to exist. It's like when you're alive, you're a human being, but when you die, that's it. There's nothing after that. And so I can understand why our community would think that this is a good idea. I guess the issue, though, is if there's a day of judgment, what's going to happen? And I know that people don't like the concept of a day of judgment. It's sort of it doesn't sit well with most of us, right? In fact, even for Christians, we don't like this concept. And the thought of giving an account for every thought we've had, every word we've had, that doesn't fill you with sort of warm fuzzies, does it? So generally in our community, along with hell, except for really, really bad people, because we still think that's a good concept, but along with hell and this sense of a day of judgment, our community as a whole has rejected it as a fable, as a fairy tale, as something that is not true, or it's just something that religious people sort of have kept as a fear, as a weapon to sort of control what people do. The Western Church, though, in all honesty, has distorted this life after death, and it's caused a lot of damage. And I just want us to look at this today with fresh eyes. I want us to look at, instead of the afterlife through this lens of punishment, but to look at it through the grace that Jesus showed, taught, and brought to earth. And if there's anything I say today that you think, nah, that's not right, I don't want you just to accept what I'm saying. Go and look in God's word. Have a look in the Bible for yourself. And have a discussion with me if you like. Like, text, email us, do something. Like, don't just accept what I'm saying. Hear for yourself from God. There are four sort of main central events that are yet to happen in the human experience, in the history of humanity. Four things that haven't yet happened. One is the return of Jesus. The second is the day of judgment. And then there's heaven and there's hell. Now, the number one prediction you'll find through the whole of the Bible is the return of Jesus. There's over 100 times in the New Testament that specifically talks about him coming back to earth. There's more in the Old Testament. But the second most frequently mentioned prediction of the future is the day of judgment. It's there everywhere. And I want to just take 3 verses and read them to you. Now, when I'm talking, probably half the stuff I say may not be worth listening to. But when I read this is God's words. These are his truths. And every one of them is really powerful. So I'm just going to read 3 verses about this day of judgment. And the first it's in Acts. And Luke says this. He says, "For he has set a day for judging the world with justice." And I'm so glad that God's justice is not the flawed legal system we have, but his justice is right and true. And then he tells us who is going to be this judge. He says, "By the man who he has appointed, and has proved to everyone who this is by raising him from the dead." So that's Jesus. And then in Corinthians, Paul says this, "For we must all stand before Christ to be judged. We will each receive whatever we deserve, good or evil, of what we've done while we're here on earth." And I know that most of us, when we hear that, we don't hear the word good, we just hear the bad. But God has this reward system, and it's amazing. It would blow our minds if we could really conceive and understand God's reward system. And one day I want to spend a Sunday talking about how God has a way of rewarding us, that we're not just meant to be good for nothing. God has a reward system. And the other verse is in Hebrews chapter 9, and that says this, "Each person is destined to die once." That's the first appointment. And after that comes judgment. That's the second appointment. The owner of Dulux Paints was found frozen to death on a mountain. And in the police report, it said that he needed a second coat. He needed another coat, right? Now, I know it's a dumb joke, but do you know what? There is an enormous amount of jokes about heaven and hell and death. It's amazing. And they're all take truth and make a mess of it. They are so far from reality, so far from what really is going to happen. And one of the big misunderstandings that I want us to just try to help us get our head around this morning before we get into this too far is this very common misunderstanding about human existence, where we think that the human experience has just 2 stages. The first stage is here on earth as a physical being, right? And then we die, and the next stage is that we go to either heaven or hell, and we get a new body. But it's just not how it is. There's actually 3 stages, 3 phases, 3 different aspects of our experience of this life that we've been given. I don't know if you've ever sat with someone that has just recently died, someone you love, you've been in a hospital, you've been sitting with them, and they've passed away. The moment they die, it's like there's a separation between their body and their spirit. They're not just asleep. What is left when their spirit goes is just a tent. It's a shell. It's not the real them. The real them, their spirit, has gone. But where does that go? And Jesus, as he hung on the cross, there's two criminals being put to death beside him, hanging either side of him. And there's a conversation goes on, and one of them starts mocking Jesus, the guy that's dying. He's mocking Jesus, and he says, well, if you're who you're meant to be, why don't you save yourself, and while you're at it, get us off here too. But the other guy, something happens inside of him. Something grabs his spirit and his heart, and he pushes back against that, and he tells the other bloke to pull his head in, and he ends up turning to Jesus, and he says this, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. That's amazing that he would say that. And then Jesus says this to him, I tell you the truth, today you'll be with me in paradise. Jesus didn't say, you'll be with me in heaven. He used a word that's only used two other times in the whole of the New Testament. And once Paul uses it when he's describing this out-of-body experience, when his spirit had a experience with God. And it literally means a place of future happiness. So where is it? Well, it doesn't really matter. It's just being with the Lord. It's being with Jesus, but it's our spirit. It's not a physical body. We don't yet get a physical body till Jesus returns to earth. And when Jesus spoke to his disciples about heaven, he spoke to them about a place that he was preparing for them. It was still being constructed. It's still being built for us, even now. The only things that we know about hell are what Jesus told us. Peter didn't tell us, Paul didn't, Luke didn't, John didn't. It's like God only trusted Jesus to share what we know about hell through Jesus. And when he spoke about hell, he said there was a place that was being prepared for the devil and his angels. And they are not there yet, and neither is anyone else. And until that day of judgment, hell is unoccupied. There's no one there. And until that day of judgment, there's no one in heaven. It's still not ready yet. So where did the Spirit go from the guy on the cross that was mocking Jesus? I don't know. And Jesus is not telling. And I know that Peter gives us a hint in one of his letters, but it's still not clear. And the Bible's really light on telling us what happens between stage 1 and stage 3. But we know this, that heaven and hell are part of stage 3. They are both places that need a physical body, and they are literal physical locations. Now, who goes there? That can't be sorted out till the day of judgment. And that can't happen until Jesus returns to earth. The last time Jesus was here, our world saw him naked, hanging on a cross, dying. But he will return, triumphant, rule of the universe, judge of the living and the resurrected dead. And deep down, we actually want a day of judgment. We want a day when things are put right. I want the justice for the child that was sexually abused by a pedophile that may have never been caught. Or if they're caught, they got off on a technicality, or they got a very light sentence. Or they get imprisoned late at the last bit of their life. I don't know if George Pell is guilty or not. Only God does. Or maybe more than God. But But God knows and I don't. But if he's innocent, I want to see him vindicated. And if he's guilty, I want him held to account. Now, on April the 22nd of this year, in the Eastern Freeway, a guy called Richard Pusey was driving his Porsche and he was clocked at 149 k's an hour. He was pulled up. He was a repeat offender. He was high on drugs. And as a result of the police pulling him up, in a chain of events, 4 policemen, a woman were killed. Now, before he fled the scene, he recorded on his phone and taunted this dying policewoman. And I know that by the time he gets through the legal system, he'll actually get away fairly lightly from his part in all that, right? And I know that the truck driver that ploughed into the cops, he's been charged with manslaughter. I get all that. But we don't have a true way of sorting out what's right or wrong in our world. We have rules, we have laws. The Royal Commission into this debacle with the hotels, right? And the consequences of that to Victoria, to the heartache of people that lost loved ones in nursing homes, to the financial pressures that's put on businesses and families across our state, this Royal Commission into that. I'm amazed at how many people don't have a very good memory. I'm amazed at how many people don't want to take personal responsibility for the decisions they make. Even emails that should have been there as evidence have been held back because lawyers outside of the Royal Commission have told their clients, no, don't, you don't have to show them that. Wherever you look in our world, there's injustice. It's everywhere. Our world is not fair. And it's not just us who one day want to see things put right, want the cover-ups and the lies to be exposed, the guilty, those that have abused and been cruel to others to be brought to account. Like if you look into the Holocaust of what took place, someone has to be accountable. If you look into the lack of value of human life in the prisoner of war camps, someone has to be held accountable. If you look at the racial abuse over the centuries, do you know, in the New Testament there's little short lists of the sort of things that would qualify you to go to hell. And in those lists, there's actually over 120 different things, but one of them might surprise you. One of them, Paul lists, is that slave traders will go to hell, will be sent to hell. Because see, God's own character demands a day of judgment, when not just people's actions, but people's thoughts, their motives, their words will be brought to account. But why a day of judgment that would be public altogether? Because God needs his justice not just to be done, but to be seen, to be completely transparent, to have nothing hidden, where every decision is right and just. And on that day, God will be vindicated. And on that day, Jesus will be vindicated. Every knee shall bow, and every mouth will admit, will confess that Jesus actually is Lord, that he is real, that this isn't just a story. And you know what? On that day, Christians are going to be vindicated. Last year, around the world, 11 Christians every day were murdered, put to death, killed because of their belief and their relationship with Jesus. And on that day, they're going to be vindicated. And on that day, you will only be found guilty or innocent. There's no hung juries. Jesus will know everything. And the outcome of this second appointment is already determined before our first appointment, before we die. We can't change anything after we die. And it's not based on being good enough. It's not this set of scales where if you sort of got enough good things going and not too many bad things, you sort of get the nod and, yep, you're right, you get in. It doesn't work that way. It all comes down to our identity. There's a description of this day in Revelations chapter 20. I want to read a little bit of it to you. It says this: if anyone's name is not found written in the book of life, he'll be thrown into the fire. If you're not got an identity in Jesus, if you have an identity in anything but Jesus, your name can't be in that book. But it's actually a day that Paul looked forward to. And he writes this in 2 Timothy. He says, Now there is in store for me the crown of righteousness. He knows as a reward, which the righteous judge, will award to me on that day. And not only to me, but also to all those who long for his appearing, for those that have a relationship with Jesus, who are identifying with him, who know him, that actually look forward to really knowing him truly. The words "go to hell" actually are not found anywhere in the Bible. And we only know about hell through Jesus, which I've said to you. And he doesn't use that word. He uses the word "throne." And that's really important, that word "throne," and I'm going to explain it to you. Hell is like an English word. It's a translation for the Greek word that Jesus used, which was Gehenna. Now, Gehenna was an actual place. It was a valley just outside of Jerusalem. It was a smouldering rubbish dump. In fact, it still existed up until the 1960s. It was a valley where child abuse had taken place to the point where they sacrificed children. Parents sacrificed children to these made-up gods. It was a place where the bodies of those that were tortured and put to death on a cross were just thrown to rot. It was a place where anything that had lost its value, that was no longer useful, that had no purpose anymore, was thrown away, including human feces. It was all there, right? And in John chapter 3, verse 16, there's a very famous verse. And as part of that, Jesus says that anyone who believes in me will not perish. Peter says in 2 Peter, God is patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish. It's the same word. And recently, we have a second-hand ride-on lawnmower, which Coral loves because she gets to ride it. I let her have the privilege of riding it, right? But unfortunately, one of the tyres went flat. And the reason it went flat is because it had perished. It still looked like a tyre to me. It still had the appearance, it was still a tyre, but it couldn't hold air anymore. It had perished. It had lost its usefulness. It had got to a place now where it's just rubbish. It's something to be thrown away, to be discarded. But Jesus is in the recycling business. And I stand before you today as a recycled failure, where my life had been perishing. And Jesus rescued me, and the mistakes I made, He's given me new opportunities. Our English Bible, it uses the word saved and salvation, but it actually means healing and being made whole. And probably a better English word than saved or salvation would be salvaged. It's a more powerful word. It better describes the thing that Jesus came to do, to reclaim, to restore us, to to make us useful again. See, perished doesn't mean that we no longer exist. It just means that we're no longer useful. I think the greatest tragedy of a human life, a life that is made in the image of God, that has purpose and destiny and a plan for this life, for your life, for someone you know, a life that no longer is useful, that is perishing here on earth, that is no longer able to function in what God had for you, or has never functioned in that area, whose name is not in the book of life. That to me is the greatest tragedy that can happen to a single human being. I want to finish with this thought. Jesus never spoke about hell to people that were unsalvaged, that were far from God. He only ever spoke about it to those that followed him, especially to his disciples. He had 2 goes at the Pharisees, the religious people, and spoke about it. But other than that, it was just to his followers. Now, that's the opposite to the way our Western church has been functioning for hundreds of years. We the Western church, have put so much effort into trying to tell people far from God about hell. But Jesus didn't do that. He spoke about the culture of heaven, the kingdom of heaven coming, and it being close. It's something available to us here and now. That he would restore the perished, that he would give purpose back to our lives, that would be useful again here on earth. Tom Varney grew up here in Bairnsdale many years ago. He was a great athlete and sportsman very young in his life. But at 13, he started hanging out in the footy clubs and the cricket clubs after the games, drinking. And by the time he was 15, he was an alcoholic. When he was 21, he developed this hatred for police in Bairnsdale. And one day he grabbed his shotgun. He loved hunting, he loved shooting, and he grabbed this gun and he loaded it up and he drove at a police car in the main street with his idea to shoot this cop and kill him. They ended up this car chase in the main street of Bairnsdale, all around the Rotunda and the Cenotaph, and ended up at the sale yards and in the morass, and he was arrested. And in a 9-month period, Tom Varney burnt 3 police cars here in Bairnsdale. And he just kept being in and out of jail. Eventually he ended up in Pentridge, and then they classified him as insane. And they sent him to Ararat to the J ward. He escaped with 2 other prisoners from Ararat prison. One of them ended up dying as a result of this. He was arrested and put back into prison. In Ararat jail, he became a Christian. He was salvaged. God started to intervene in his life as he opened up and invited Jesus to come into his life. And to the point his life changed so much that he was no longer classed as insane, which meant that he could stand trial again for all the stuff he hadn't been jailed for. So they chucked him in the back of a divvy van and they brought him back to Bairnsdale. And there was this massive trial here in Bairnsdale, so big that they ended up shifting it to Melbourne. And do you know the result of that trial? The government of the day, the Victorian government, gave him a full pardon because his life was transformed so much by what Jesus had done in him. The first time I met Tom Varney, he had written this book called From Gutter to Glory. In fact, I took him deer hunting and took him up out the bush, and wherever he went out the bush when he was deer hunting, he'd find at the start of little tracks, he'd find a log or something, a stump, and he'd put a little Bible verse on it, and he'd put a rock on top, and he'd leave it there for someone to find. Unusual guy, but an unusual story. I wish I could tell you all the detail of his life story, but just the name of the book, From Gutter to Glory, really says it all. It's from perished to restored. It's from no purpose to purpose. And I know that Tom Varney is probably 80 now, and I know he'll have an appointment with God one day. And he's going to hear, "Well done, good and faithful servant," who has lived a life that has been adding value to others. It began pretty rough, but see, God is in the recycling business. And I don't know where your life is, but if God can do that for Tom, if he can do it for me, he can do it for you. There is nothing that God can't redeem. There's nothing he can't restore. I just really encourage you this day to understand that life is in different phases. We're in one now. And the things that we choose, the things that we decide, affect us now. Also, they affect us in the future. But I'm telling you, there is not a better way to live than putting God first in your life. Honestly, it is the best way to go. Now, I've been wanting to get to heaven. I mean, I don't mean literally get to heaven, but I want to be wanting to talk about heaven, and I'm going to do that next time I speak. But next week we have a guest. We have Luke Raymond, Jeff's son, my nephew, and I'm really looking forward to him speaking. So we've got this special guest next week, and we'll see you then. I'm going to hand back to Rachel. She's going to lead us in a song, and then we'll finish.